The wind in the Dakota Territory doesn't just blow, it scrapes. It smells of dust and cattle and endings, and it was the first thing Clara noticed when she stepped off that creaking wagon. It clung to her plain dress like a warning. She was a woman over 50, shipped west like a piece of unwanted furniture, her value reduced to the ink on a mail-order bride contract. Her family hadn't waved goodbye with tears. They'd watched her leave with the quiet relief of a debt finally settled. Clara carried no treasures, just a small leather satchel. Inside was a change of clothes, a Bible with a cracked spine, and the letter that was supposed to be her future. She'd spent a lifetime being invisible, too old, too plain, too quiet. She'd raised siblings who never thanked her and swallowed her own bitterness until it was a permanent part of her. So when she saw the ranch, a lonely shape against a vast empty sky, she braced for the worst. She expected a man who would look at her the way you look at livestock, weighing her worth in calluses and obedience. She was prepared for it. She was ready to fold herself up small, just like she'd always done. But Thomas Boone, the rancher she was promised to, wasn't what she expected. He was tall, with shoulders as wide as a barn door, and hair that was more salt than pepper. His eyes held a deep, quiet sadness, the kind that comes from loss that never quite leaves you. He took the letter from her trembling hand, read it once, and let it drop to his side. The silence stretched out, pulled taut by the humming wind. Clara felt a hot flush creep up her neck. This was it, the judgment, the dismissal. But then he spoke, and his voice was low and steady, not cruel, not even impatient. He looked her right in the eye, and the words he said cracked open a world she thought was sealed shut forever. "I'm not here to own you." Just that. 7 words that hit her harder than any insult ever had. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. But he didn't say it again. He just turned and gestured toward the house, a sturdy home of timber and stone. He was inviting her in, not as a possession, but as a guest. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara felt a little sliver of air enter her lungs. It wasn't hope, not yet. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was different, and different was a start. That night, lying in a narrow bed that smelled of cedar, she whispered the words to herself. "I'm not here to own you." They felt fragile in her mind, like glass, and she knew with the certainty of a survivor that one wrong move could shatter them to pieces. The next morning, Clara was up before the sun. Habit was a cruel master, and hers was carved from decades of serving others. She moved through the small, quiet kitchen like a ghost, her fingers tracing the sparse shelves. Beans, flour, not much else. She set a pot of water to boil without being asked. Duty was the only language she knew. When Thomas came in, his heavy boots echoing on the floorboards, he stopped dead in his tracks. He wasn't used to seeing anyone in his kitchen. For years, silence had been his only breakfast companion. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Clara's hand paused on the wooden spoon. "I know," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "But I need to." He just watched her for a long moment, the pale morning light catching the tired lines around her eyes. Then something flickered in his memory, a ghost of a thought. "Have we met before?" The question hung in the air, surprising them both. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't thought he'd remember. She hadn't dared to hope. "The winter of '83, she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "The blizzard. It came on so sudden. You were thrown from your horse." Thomas's eyes went distant. The memory, buried under years of grief and hard work, began to surface. Snow, the blinding, biting white, the feeling of falling, then stumbling, half dead, through a world that had disappeared. And then, a voice, a woman's voice cutting through the howl of the wind, guiding him toward a small hidden cabin. He remembered a fire, hot broth being pressed into his frozen hands. He'd been too broken, too proud to even ask her name. When he woke up the next day, she was gone. "That was you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a revelation. Clara just nodded, a faint blush on her cheeks. "I only did what anyone would have." But Thomas shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No," he said, his gaze finally losing its guarded edge. "Not anyone. Most folks would have left a stranger to the storm." He wasn't looking at a mail-order bride anymore. He was looking at the woman who had saved his life. The air in the kitchen shifted. The silence wasn't empty now. It was full. It was warm. Clara felt a knot in her shoulders, a knot she'd been carrying for 30 years, begin to loosen. They worked side by side that day. She kneaded bread with hands that knew the rhythm of survival, while he mended a fence line just outside the window. Every so often he'd glance in and she'd be there, a quiet, steady presence in a house that had been empty for too long. When the bread was done, she placed a warm slice on the table for him. He sat down, took a bite, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was the beginning of something. But as Clara lay in bed that night, listening to the wind, she knew this wasn't just fate. A contract had brought her here, yes, but a secret had tied their lives together long before that. A secret born in a blizzard. And she couldn't help but wonder if that secret was a foundation strong enough to build a new life on, or if it was just the first crack in a story destined to fall apart. The rhythm of the ranch settled around them like a comfortable blanket. Clara cooked and cleaned, her quiet diligence breathing life back into the dusty corners of the house. Thomas worked the land, his movements measured and strong, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. But outside the bubble of the ranch, whispers were starting to grow. In a place like Dry Creek, gossip travels faster than a prairie fire. Thomas Boone, the grieving widower, had taken a bride, a mail-order bride, and she was old, plain. Her own family didn't want her, why would he? A man muttered at the mercantile, just loud enough for Clara to hear. The words were like tiny, sharp stones hitting her skin. She kept her chin high, but her hands trembled as she paid for the flour. Each whisper was a ghost from her past, hissing the same old story. "You are a burden. You are not worthy of being chosen." That evening, Thomas found her kneading dough with a fury, her knuckles white. "You don't need their approval," he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara's hands stopped. "Then why am I here, Thomas?" The question burst out of her, laced with a lifetime of hurt. "My family sent me to be a duty, a weight for someone else to carry." Thomas's gaze softened. "I told you the day you arrived. I'm not here to own you." "Then what am I?" she pressed, her voice breaking. "A cook, a ghost to fill the quiet rooms?" He stepped closer, the firelight casting long shadows across the floor. "You're the woman who saved me in a storm," he said, his voice firm. "You're the woman who stands tall when the world tries to beat you down. I don't need ownership, Clara. I need someone who stays." The words hung between them. Someone who stays. She had always stayed. Stayed through insults, through neglect, through being made to feel worthless. Staying had always been her cage. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe this time was different. But the scars on her heart were deep, and they whispered that trust was a fool's game. As she lay in her bed that night, the town's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. But beneath it, she could hear Thomas's words, a steady, quiet heartbeat. "I need someone who stays." Could her prison ever become her freedom? Or was she just trading one cage for another? The fragile peace she was building felt like a house of cards, and she knew the slightest breeze could send it all tumbling down. She just didn't realize the breeze was about to become a hurricane. It started with a small thing, a misplaced tool from the barn. Thomas was sure he'd left his hammer by the forge, but it was gone. He shrugged it off. A few days later, a section of the northern fence was cut. Not broken, but cleanly cut, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off. It took them a full day to round them up. Thomas's face was grim. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. The town's whispers grew louder, but now they had a sharper edge. They weren't just mocking Clara. They were targeting Thomas. "Maybe he's losing his grip," someone said at the saloon. "Ever since that woman showed up, his luck's been turning sour." The poison was spreading, and then Clara found it. Tucked under her mattress, a place no one should have been, was a small, crudely made doll of corn husks, with a strand of her own gray hair tied around its neck. A pin was stuck right through its heart. It was a threat, clear and cold. Someone didn't just want her gone. They wanted her to suffer. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was hatred. This was a promise of violence. She hid the doll, her hands shaking. Who in this town hated her so much? She barely knew anyone. Her mind raced, sifting through the sneering faces at the mercantile, the mocking ranch hands. But it felt deeper than that. This felt personal. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind outside sounded like it was whispering her name, a long, mournful cry. She crept out of her room and into the main living space. A floorboard creaked under her weight. From the shadows in the corner, Thomas spoke, his voice startling her. "Couldn't sleep either." He was sitting in his chair, a rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the dark windows. He wasn't just sitting. He was standing guard. He knew. He knew they were in danger. "Thomas," she whispered, "what's happening?" He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the darkness outside. "There are old grudges in this land, Clara. Some folks believe this ranch should have never been mine." And then he told her about his late wife, Sarah. She hadn't been from around here. She'd inherited the ranch from a distant uncle. When she married Thomas, an outsider himself, it had stirred up a hornet's nest. Sarah's cousin, a woman named Elsbeth, had been raised to believe the land would one day be hers. She had never forgiven Sarah for it. Elsbeth lived on the neighboring property, and her hatred for Thomas had festered for years. After Sarah passed, Thomas said, his voice heavy, Elsbeth tried to claim the land. Said I had no right to it. The law sided with me, but that didn't stop her. She's been a thorn in my side ever since. Clara's mind flashed to a woman she'd seen in town, a woman with cold, hard eyes and a mouth set in a permanent sneer. Elsbeth. She thinks I'm here to solidify your claim, Clara breathed. She thinks I'm the final lock on the door she wants to break down. She's trying to scare you off, Thomas said, his knuckles white on the rifle. She thinks if you run, it proves I'm unstable. It gives her another angle to challenge my ownership in front of the magistrate. Suddenly it all made sense. The cut fence, the stolen tools, the whispers she was intentionally spreading. The doll. It was all Elsbeth, a calculated campaign of terror designed to break them. She won't succeed, Clara said, and the strength in her own voice surprised her. She had been running her whole life, from her family, from shame, from a world that told her she was worthless. She wasn't running anymore. Thomas finally turned to look at her, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it he saw a spine of steel he was just beginning to recognize. He gave a slow nod. "No," he said. "She won't." But as they sat there in the armed silence, a new, more terrifying thought crept into Clara's mind. Elsbeth's hatred was old and deep. What if she wouldn't stop at just trying to scare them? What if she was willing to do anything to get the land she believed was hers? Anything at all. The breaking point arrived on a blistering Sunday afternoon. The air was thick with dust and the smell of impending rain as Clara and Thomas rode into town for supplies. The moment they stepped onto the main street, every eye was on them. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were open speculation, fueled by Elspeth's venom. As Clara walked a few steps behind Thomas, a group of ranch hands, men who worked for Elspeth, blocked her path. They were lounging near the saloon, their faces smug. "Well, look what the wind blew in," one of them sneered, spitting tobacco juice near her boots. "Boone's mail-order housekeeper," another one chimed in, his voice loud for all to hear. "I hear they're cheaper than mules these days, less stubborn, too." Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. It was the same laughter that had haunted Clara her entire life. It echoed with her father's dismissive grunts, her siblings' mocking jibes. Usually she would have lowered her head and hurried past, letting the shame wash over her. But not today. Something inside her, a cord that had been stretched taut for 50 years, finally snapped. She stopped dead in the muddy street. She set down her basket, the movement deliberate and slow. Then she turned and faced them. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud, but it cut through the laughter like a knife. "I am not cheap," she said, her eyes locking onto the ringleader. "I am not less. I am a woman who has worked, who has lost, and who is still standing. If my strength is amusing to you, then you are a smaller man than I thought." The saloon went dead silent. The piano player inside even stopped, a chord hanging unfinished in the air. The ranch hands shuffled their feet, their smirks wiped clean off their faces. They had expected a mouse, and a lioness had roared. Before they could recover, Thomas was there. He didn't step in front of her to shield her. He stepped beside her, a silent, unshakable wall. His voice was calm, but it held the cold weight of iron. "She's here because I asked her to be," he said, his gaze sweeping over the men. "And a man who finds his courage by mocking a woman's spirit isn't a man at all. He's a coward." He let the word hang there. Coward. Then, without another word, he picked up her basket, offered her his arm, and they walked away, leaving the men speechless in the street. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like a burden being defended. She felt like a partner, standing on equal ground. A wave of something fierce and unfamiliar washed through her. It was power, her own. That night the storm broke, rain lashing against the windows of the ranch house. Inside it was quiet. Thomas placed a mug of hot coffee in her hands. He didn't talk about what happened in town. He didn't have to. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Clara," he said softly. "Not to them, and not to me." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the deep loneliness he carried, a mirror to her own. "My whole life," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been owned by my family's expectations, by my own fear. Today I felt like I belonged to myself." He nodded, his gaze steady and warm. "That's a good place to start. Maybe one day you'll feel like you belong here, too." The words settled in her heart like rain on parched earth. Staying no longer felt like a prison sentence. It felt like a choice. It felt like planting a flag in the ground and daring the world to try and move it. She had found her voice. She had found her strength. But as the thunder rolled across the prairie, she knew the fight was far from over. Elspeth was not the kind of woman to be deterred by one small victory. She had only been testing their defenses. Now that she knew they wouldn't break easily, she would come back with something far worse. The question was, what and when? The answer came sooner than she could have ever imagined, and it didn't come in the form of a threat. It came in the form of a letter from a past she thought she had buried for good. Thomas found it tucked into the general delivery mail when he went for supplies. He held it out to her, his brow furrowed with concern at the familiar, sharp handwriting on the envelope, her brother's hand. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words were not just ink on paper, they were lashes. "Clara, you belong to us. We sent you west to be useful, not to bring more shame on this family. You are nothing without us. We have received an inquiry from a sheriff out of Willow Creek about the winter of '83, about the blizzard, about the man who died in that cabin with you. You will come home now, or we will tell him everything." The world tilted. The air rushed from her lungs. The blizzard. He knew. Her brother, Ethan, knew the one secret she had carried like a stone in her gut for 17 years. The secret that was far darker than Thomas could ever imagine. Thomas saw the blood drain from her face. "Clara, what is it?" She crumpled the letter in her fist, shaking her head. "It's nothing. Just old family matters." But it wasn't nothing. It was a chain yanking her back to a past she couldn't outrun. That night she didn't sleep. The memory of the blizzard came rushing back, not as a heroic rescue, but as the nightmare it truly was. She hadn't been alone when she found Thomas. There was another man in that cabin, a trapper named Jed, who had gotten there first. At first, she was grateful for the company. But as the storm raged on, Jed's eyes had turned ugly. He saw a lone woman, trapped. He had tried to force himself on her. She fought back, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from the hearth. In the struggle, he had slipped on the icy floor, his head cracking against the stone fireplace. He never got up. She had panicked. She had cleaned up the scene as best she could, dragged Jed's body out into the blinding snow, and when Thomas had finally woken, she had fled, telling no one. Now her brother was threatening to expose her, to paint her as a murderer. The next morning, Thomas found her by the door, her small satchel packed. "I have to leave," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "They're right. I bring trouble wherever I go." Thomas's voice was like a physical barrier, stopping her. "Look at me, Clara." When she finally did, his eyes weren't angry. They were filled with a fierce resolve. "I told you I'm not here to own you. But you can't let them own you either. If you run now, you're not choosing freedom. You're letting them put the chains right back on." "But you don't understand," she cried, the secret clawing at her throat. "What if I'm not the woman you think I am? What if there's a darkness in my past?" "Then we face it together," he said, his voice unwavering. "Whatever it is, it's not as strong as the woman who stood in the middle of the street and silenced a crowd of cowards." His faith in her was a terrible, beautiful burden, but the fear was overwhelming. Her brother's threat, Elspeth's hatred, the old lie she had lived with for so long. It was all closing in. That evening she took the letter to the fireplace and watched the flames consume it, turning her brother's threats to ash. But destroying the paper didn't destroy the truth. The secret was still inside her, a poison that could destroy everything she was starting to build with Thomas. She was trapped between two impossible choices: stay and risk her secret destroying them both, or run and prove her family, Elspeth, and the entire world right, that she was, and always would be, nothing more than a burden. A new and terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place in her mind. Willow Creek, the town her brother had mentioned. Willow Creek was Elsbeth's hometown. Jed, the man who died in the cabin. His last name had been Miller, and she remembered hearing in town that Elsbeth's maiden name was Miller. A cold dread, far deeper than any she had felt before, washed over her. Jed wasn't just some random trapper. He was Elspeth's brother. Elspeth didn't just hate her for being with Thomas. Elspeth had been searching for the mysterious woman from the blizzard for 17 years, believing that woman had murdered her beloved younger brother. And now, thanks to Ethan's greed, she was about to find her. The war for the ranch was no longer just about land. It had become a war for Clara's life. The days that followed were thick with a tension you could cut with a knife. Every knock at the door, every rider on the horizon, sent a jolt of fear through Clara. She felt like a trapped animal, waiting for the hunter's net to fall. She tried to tell Thomas. Night after night she would start the sentence, "Thomas, about that blizzard," but the words would die in her throat. How could she tell him she was responsible for the death of his enemy's brother? How could she ask him to stand by her when the truth would bring the full force of Elsbeth's vengeance and the law down upon them? The lie was a wall between them, and the quiet understanding they had built was beginning to crumble under its weight. Thomas knew something was wrong. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she jumped at every sound. He saw her scrubbing the floors with a frantic energy, as if she could wash away the secret staining her soul. He didn't push. He just watched, his presence a silent, steady question she couldn't bring herself to answer. He started sleeping with the rifle by his bed again. Not for Elsbeth's men, but for something more. He could feel it coming. A storm far worse than any blizzard. The first sign of its arrival was the sheriff. He rode up to the ranch one afternoon, his face a grim mask. Elsbeth was with him. Her eyes burned with a triumphant hatred as she stared at Clara. "Thomas," the sheriff said, not bothering with pleasantries, "Mrs. Miller here has filed a formal complaint. She's received new information regarding the death of her brother, Jedediah Miller, back in the winter of '83. He turned his cold eyes on Clara. "Information that suggests you were the last person to see him alive." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was happening. "She's lying," Thomas said, his voice a low growl as he stepped in front of Clara. "This is just another attempt to harass us." "Is it?" the sheriff asked, looking at Clara. "Were you in a cabin with Jedediah Miller during that blizzard?" Clara couldn't speak. A simple yes would be a confession. A no would be a lie that would crumble in an instant. Her silence was all the answer they needed. "We'll be opening a formal inquiry," the sheriff said, his tone final. "Don't you be leaving the territory, ma'am." Elsbeth smiled, a cruel, satisfied twist of her lips. She had him. She had them both. As they rode away, Clara finally broke. Sobs tore from her chest, the kind that come from a place of absolute despair. "It's true," she gasped, sinking to the ground. "Thomas, it's all true." And there, on the dusty ground of the ranch she had just started to call home, she told him everything. The trapper's ugly intentions, the struggle, the iron skillet, the fear that had driven her to hide his body and flee. She left nothing out, her confession a torrent of shame and terror held back for 17 years. When she finished, she couldn't look at him. She waited for the disgust, the anger, the inevitable command to leave his property. The silence stretched on, broken only by her ragged breathing. Finally, he knelt in front of her. He didn't say anything. He just gently took her hand. His touch was not one of judgment. It was firm, grounding. "You defended yourself, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "That's not murder. That's survival." Tears streamed down her face. He believed her. Even after the lie, even with the impossible truth laid bare between them, he believed her. For a moment, a tiny flicker of hope ignited in the darkness. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. It was her word against a 17-year-old cold case, fueled by the relentless hatred of a woman who now had the law on her side. Her brother had given Elsbeth the weapon, and Elsbeth was now pointing it straight at Clara's heart. And then the final, devastating blow landed. A rider appeared on the horizon, not from the direction of town, but from the east. As he got closer, Clara recognized him. The slumped shoulders, the cruel set of his jaw. It was her brother. Ethan had arrived. He hadn't just sent a letter. He had come in person to collect on his blackmail, ready to feed Clara to the wolves to get what he wanted. The net hadn't just fallen. It was tightening, and Clara knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it was about to strangle them all. Ethan dismounted with the smug confidence of a man who holds all the cards. He ignored Clara completely, his eyes sizing up the ranch, calculating its worth. Brother-in-law, he said to Thomas, a greasy smile on his face. Looks like my sister's landed on her feet. You've got a nice spread here. A man could get comfortable. Thomas's face was like stone. You're not welcome here. Ethan laughed, a short, ugly sound. Oh, I think I am. See, I'm the key to all your problems. My sister, she's got a bit of a legal issue hanging over her head, but for the right price I can make that all disappear. I'm the only other person who knows what really happened in that cabin. I can tell the sheriff I was there. I can say Jed attacked her. I can be her star witness. The demand was clear. He wanted to be paid for the truth. He was extorting them. And if I don't pay? Thomas asked, his voice dangerously low. Ethan's smile vanished. Then I tell the sheriff I saw Clara hit him first. I tell him she robbed him. I'll paint a picture so ugly they'll be building the gallows before lunchtime. Your choice. He was a snake, and he was squeezing them, enjoying their helplessness. Clara felt a rage so pure and hot, it burned away her fear. For 50 years she had been bullied, used and discarded by this man, by her family. He had sold her like property, and now he was trying to sell her freedom. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it cracked like a whip. No more. You will not have another dime, another piece of my life. I would rather hang for the truth than live one more day in debt to a man like you. Ethan was stunned. He had expected tears, begging. He hadn't expected this iron-willed stranger. Before he could respond, Thomas moved. He grabbed Ethan by the collar, his grip like a vice, and propelled him back toward his horse. Get off my land, Thomas snarled, his voice a low thunder. And if you ever show your face here again, the sheriff will be the last of your worries. He shoved Ethan, who stumbled and fell in the dirt. Scrambling back onto his horse, Ethan's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. You'll regret this, both of you. I'm going straight to Elsbeth. She'll pay me, and she'll pay me well for the story she wants to hear. He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. The momentary victory felt hollow. They had called his bluff, but in doing so, they had unleashed their worst enemy. Ethan would go straight to Elsbeth and give her the lies she needed to see Clara hang. They were out of time. We have to run, Thomas, Clara said, her voice trembling. We can pack what we can and be gone by morning. Thomas shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Ethan had disappeared. No, I've spent my life letting others define me, letting this town whisper about my wife's death, letting Elsbeth poison my name. This is my land. This is our home. We're not running. We're fighting. How? Clara cried. It's my word against theirs. Ethan and Elsbeth will tell a story, and the law will believe them. Because a lie is a lie, Thomas said, turning to her, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. And the truth has a way of leaving scars. We just have to find them. He walked into the house, Clara following, confused. He went to the old hearth, the same one where Jed had fallen. He pried a loose stone from the side, a stone Clara had never noticed before. From the dark cavity behind it, he pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary. It was Sarah's, he said, his voice thick with old grief. She wrote in it every day. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to read it. But I couldn't bear to throw it away, either. I hid it here. He opened the book, his rough fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. He stopped at an entry dated just a few days before the blizzard of '83. He read it aloud. Elsbeth's brother, Jed, was here today. He frightens me. There is a cruelty in his eyes. He spoke of women in a way that made my skin crawl. He boasted about trapping more than just animals in the winter. I warned him to stay away from our land. Clara stared at the book, her heart pounding. It was proof. It was corroboration of Jed's character, written in an honest hand years before the event. It was a voice from the grave, speaking in her defense. But as Thomas kept reading, his face grew pale. He flipped forward, his movements becoming more urgent. He read another entry, this one from the year after the blizzard. Elsbeth is consumed by grief, but it has twisted into something ugly. She blames me for Jed's death. She says a woman was with him, and that I must know who. She has started small things. A sick calf, a broken tool. She said this land should be hers, and that she will see me in the ground before she lets me have it. Thomas looked up at Clara, his eyes wide with a terrible understanding. "She's been doing this for years," he whispered. "The things happening now, this isn't new. She was doing the same thing to Sarah." And then came the final, soul-crushing entry, written on the last day of Sarah's life. "I cannot take it any more. Elsbeth's poison has seeped into everything. The town looks at me with suspicion. Thomas is pulling away, lost in his own fight, to save this ranch. She told me today that she would never stop until I was gone. She has won. The only way to make it stop is to leave. Tell Thomas I love him. Tell him it wasn't his fault. It was the land. The land was cursed with her greed." Thomas sank into a chair, the diary falling from his hands. His wife hadn't just been sad. She hadn't just given up. Elsbeth had driven her to it. For years he had lived with the guilt, believing he had failed her. But it wasn't him. It was Elsbeth. She hadn't just harassed them. She had psychologically tormented his wife until she saw no other way out. Elsbeth wasn't just a greedy neighbor. She was a monster, responsible for the death of 2 people in her family, all for a plot of land. They now had the truth, the whole, ugly, devastating truth. But their enemies were already on the move. Through the window they saw a cloud of dust in the distance. Riders, the sheriff, and leading them side by side were Elsbeth and Ethan. They were coming to make their arrest, armed with a lie, and Clara and Thomas had only a few precious minutes to figure out how a dead woman's diary could possibly stand against a hangman's noose. The riders thundered into the yard, a posse of grim-faced men, led by a triumphant Elsbeth. The sheriff dismounted, his hand already resting on his pistol. "Thomas Boone," he yelled, "we have a warrant for the arrest of Clara May on the charge of murder." Thomas and Clara stepped out onto the porch, standing side by side. Clara's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but standing next to Thomas, holding Sarah's diary, she felt a strange calm settle over her. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice ringing with authority. "You've been listening to lies." "I've been listening to a witness," the sheriff shot back, gesturing to Ethan, who was smirking behind him. "Mr. Ethan here saw the whole thing. Says your woman here murdered Jed Miller in cold blood." "He's lying," Clara said, her voice clear and steady. "He wasn't there. He is trying to extort money from my husband." Elsbeth laughed, a venomous sound. "The desperate lies of a killer. She trapped my brother and killed him for his furs. Arrest her." The sheriff took a step forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You'll have to come with me." "No," Thomas said, and he held up the diary. "Before you do, you need to read this. This is my late wife's journal, and it tells a different story." The sheriff paused, frowning. "A diary? What does that have to do with this?" "It has everything to do with it," Thomas said. He opened it to the first entry about Jed. "This is what my wife, Elsbeth's own cousin, thought of Jedediah Miller. Read it." He tossed the book to the sheriff, who caught it, surprised. The sheriff's eyes scanned the page, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. He looked up at Elsbeth. "Did you know your brother had a reputation?" "Lies, all lies," Elsbeth shrieked. "Sarah was a weak, foolish woman. That book proves nothing." It proves character, Thomas said, his voice cutting through her rant. And it proves more than that. Keep reading, Sheriff. Read about the threats. Read about the poisoned wells and the sick cattle. Read about how Elsbeth tormented my wife for years, all because of this land. The sheriff continued to read, his face growing darker with every page he turned. The men in the posse began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably. They were seeing a story unfold they had never imagined. Finally, the sheriff read the last, heartbreaking entry. He closed the book slowly, the silence in the yard absolute. He looked at Elsbeth, and his eyes were filled with a cold, dawning horror. He saw the truth. He saw the monster standing in front of him. "She drove my wife to her death," Thomas said, his voice breaking with 17 years of suppressed grief. "That's the real crime you should be investigating." Elsbeth's face contorted with rage. "He's lying. They're twisting everything." But her panic was obvious. Ethan, seeing the tide turn against him, tried to slink away. "Not so fast," Thomas said, pointing a finger at him. "This man showed up here yesterday. He offered to lie for us for a price. When we refused, he went to her. He's guilty of extortion and bearing false witness." The sheriff looked from the diary to Ethan's terrified face, then to Elsbeth's unraveling composure. The pieces all clicked into place. He walked over to Elsbeth, his face grim. "Elsbeth Miller," he said, his voice like gravel, "I think you and I need to have a long talk about the death of Sarah Boone." He then turned to two of his deputies. "And take this one into custody," he said, jerking a thumb at Ethan. "He's got a lot of explaining to do." As the deputies grabbed a sputtering Ethan, Elsbeth let out a final, desperate scream of pure hatred. It was the sound of a woman whose entire world, built on a foundation of lies and greed, had just come crashing down around her. The fight was over. Justice, long buried, had finally been unearthed. The posse left, taking a furious Elsbeth and a whimpering Ethan with them. In the quiet aftermath, Clara and Thomas stood alone on the porch, the setting sun bathing the prairie in a soft golden light. Clara looked at the house, at the land, at the man standing beside her. She had arrived here as a piece of property, a burden to be endured. She had been haunted by her past, hunted by her enemies. But through it all, she had found something she never believed was possible. A home, and a partner who had seen her, not for the labels the world had given her, but for the survivor she truly was. Thomas took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The touch was no longer just grounding. It was a promise. "I told you I wasn't here to own you, Clara," he said softly, "and I'm not. But I'd be honored if you'd choose to stay, to build a life here with me, as my wife, as my equal." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but for the first time in her life they were tears of pure joy. "I've been staying since the day I arrived, Thomas," she whispered. "I'm already home." The story of Clara, the mail-order bride, could have ended the day she arrived, a quiet tragedy of a woman discarded. But one man's words, "I'm not here to own you," changed everything. They were more than just words. They were a recognition of her humanity, a gift of respect that allowed her to reclaim her own strength. This story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to find love, and never too late to find yourself. True love doesn't possess, it liberates. It doesn't demand, it stands beside. It sees the scars you carry and calls them beautiful. If you've ever felt worthless, invisible, or believed you were too broken to be loved, remember Clara. Remember that your worth is not determined by the family that discarded you, or the world that judged you. It is forged in the fires you walk through and the quiet dignity with which you stand your ground. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of resilience and redemption in the Wild West. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength, and leave a comment below. Would you like to hear more stories about characters like Clara and Thomas? We read every single one. Thank you for listening.